Hey guys, this is Miss Edens, and today we are moving on to the outer parts of the stems and the roots. So the first thing we need to talk about are what are the main jobs of the stems, okay? So the main jobs of your stem, or the main functions as I like to call it, are one, they move material up and down through the stem, materials being things like water, and the nutrients that are brought up through the water, as well as the glucose that's made in the leaves, has to be carried down to the roots through the stem. They're also going to provide support. So they're going to hold up all the leaves as well as the reproductive structures. If you remember, reproductive structures would be your flowers and your fruits. You can store some food in your stems, so some of that glucose that's made can happen in your stems, as well as a little bit of photosynthesis. And then we can also reproduce plants from just a piece of the stem, known as a stem cutting. Okay, so let's look at the different parts of the stem. Some of these we've already discussed, like lenticels. Lenticels, you already know, are breathing pores, and they can appear as little dots or bumps along the stems. The buds, we've talked about different buds when we were talking about leaves, and you should know by now that a bud is where something new is going to come out of it. Now, for the most part, the buds coming out of a stem usually will be leaf buds, or they could be a new part of the stem, or they can be fruits or flowers coming out. So, but you've got two different types of buds. The first one we talked about is the terminal bud. That's usually going to be at the very end of your final stem. So the word terminal means at the end. So like at the airport, when you're rushing to get to the terminal, that's the very end before you get onto your airplane. We also have what are called axillary buds. Axillary buds are going to be on the sides of the stems usually, and that's where your leaves are coming out of. And then the little stems, if you have a compound leaf, would come from that. Bud scale scars. So bud scale scars are pretty cool. They're not shown really well on this diagram, but a bud scale scar is the terminal bud scale. And I've got another diagram I'll post on the website that is basically where the terminal bud was the year before. So you can actually see how far it grew from in 1 year's time. Leaf scars are usually going to be on the sides of the stems as well, and that's where previous year's leaves may have fallen off throughout the stem growth. It could be also where the stipules that are at the base of a leaf have fallen off as well. Let's look real quick. Here is a cool little video I like to show that shows kind of a slow motion of the terminal buds and the axillary buds opening up on a stem in the springtime. So they were already kind of there waiting. It's just neat to kind of watch and see how that comes about. But the ones on the ends, those are your terminal buds. All right, let's go back to our notes. So you do have some appendages on our stems, or like kind of extra things on the sides. Things like a thorn. Thorn would usually be a very large, prickly, adaptive feature on a stem. A prickle would be a small one, kind of like on a rose. And then tendrils. We've talked about a lot of fruits and vegetables that have these little tendrils or extra stems that wrap around things to help hold them up, because usually they're a vine grower or something like that. So these are some extra appendages you might find on your stems. Now, some important things you need to know about modified stems. So we learned with leaves that you can have a modified leaf, like a bract would be a modified leaf. It has a special job. It's not a normal stem, but it has a special job. So we've got 4 of those we like to cover for starters. So the first one is a stolon, and you're actually going to learn about that this week in Plant ID. So that's where your plant has an above ground stem that usually grows out horizontally and would then put off another plant that could root in. So it kind of spreads that way. Strawberries are a great example of this. And then rhizomes are the same thing. They're going to put out these side shoots, but the stems are going to be underground. Irises, that you'll study a little bit later on, are a great example of having a rhizome. So you now have this shoot putting off new plants underground, and then the stem comes up from it, which means you can actually cut these off here and then separate it, divide it. You would have two separate plants. Cladophyls, these are stems that you find usually on a cactus plant. It still can put flowers off of that extra stem, and you can actually break these off and plant these in order to create new plants. A tuber is like a potato. Sweet potatoes, white potatoes, all your different types of potatoes would be a tuber. It is a storage stem, sometimes called a storage root. Because it's modified, it counts as either or. But you'll notice a potato can grow stems and it can grow roots of it. So that's why we call it a modified stem. But it does store all of the nutrients that the plant needs. So your root functions, the job of your roots. These are really important. Your roots must anchor the plant, hold it steady, hold it upright so that it can grow. Without a good root system, your plant's going to fall over and it's going to die. Your roots have the main job of absorbing water and minerals from the soil. Okay, but the minerals have to be in the water for the plant to absorb it. Roots cannot absorb minerals and nutrients just straight. It has to come through the water. The roots store large quantities of the plant food. They really are the storage system for the food, the plant. Whether it's going to be deciduous or evergreen, most of your food is stored in the roots. Then you can reproduce or propagate some plants just by having a root cutting. So just a piece of the root, you could possibly grow a whole new plant. So let's look at a couple things. Labeling a root's pretty easy because you really only have two parts. And that's going to be your root caps. Root caps are where the new growth cells happen. So if a terminal bud is the tip of a stem, the root cap would be the very tip of a root going down. Okay, so that's where all your new growth is happening, and that'll be important later. So roots grow down, so the very tip of the root cap is where all your new growth happens. Root hairs are like teeny tiny little hairs all along the roots, and they are what absorb the water. And then, of course, the minerals through the water. So we have two different types of root systems that you need to learn. We have a taproot system, like you see here on the right, very similar to like a carrot. It's a great way to explain it or imagine it. It's got one big, large primary root with just a few small hairs coming off of it, or small lateral roots coming off of it. But you have one primary root. A fibrous root system is going to have multiple primary roots, not one big one. It's going to spread out much more and be very shallow, like your maple trees that we talked about. So let's look at some advantages and disadvantages. Taproots. Because that one large root, it actually can go really, really deep. And because it can go deep, it can absorb a lot of water from those lower levels. Even if it's dry and it hasn't rained in a month, these roots can really grab water from the bottom. And because it goes deep, it usually anchors the plant really, really well. So it may not blow over in storms as much. A disadvantage to that, though, is if you are growing trees in a field and you try to dig them up to sell, when you go to harvest them, you're going to cut off a large part of that root system. They also do not stabilize well. What I mean by stabilize, is that they don't like to be transplanted very often. So it's going to take it a little bit longer to adjust if you have to move it. Fibrous root systems, advantages to that would be that your roots are shallower, which means they can get a lot of the nutrition and the fertilization faster. The top is where all of your microorganisms and composting materials break down, so there's a lot of nutrients up there at the top. If it's raining, it can get water fast, okay? But the other side to that is it's not going to be as drought resistant. If it hasn't rained in a long time, it's not going to have deep root systems to be able to access lower water. They do transplant a lot better, so if you're moving it from one place to another, it can stabilize faster. And the other disadvantage would be that these roots that are all shallow can get exposed a lot. So like if you're mowing the grass, you may start to hit some of the roots. The soil may wash away and they'll be more exposed. So you'll see a lot of those roots, and they can also sometimes buckle up concrete. There's a few modified root systems we need to learn really quick. The first one is an adventitious root system. And this is basically roots that come off of a stem above the ground. Corn does this a lot, as well as do a lot of cypress trees in swampy areas. So think of corn, it's really tall and skinny. It would blow over very easily. So they put these little extra roots off to the side so that it can help it stabilize and grow up a little bit better that way. There's a little diagram. You can see your taproot versus your primary root there. A few storage roots I want you to learn about. These are basically modified root systems or modified stems. They're kind of in between. So we talked about tubers already, and we talked about the rhizomes. But two new ones are bulbs and corms. So these really do store all of the nutrients for these plants. These are often either annuals or herbaceous perennial plants that are going to die back each winter. The main difference in a bulb and a corm, if you notice, is the shape. An onion would be a great example of a bulb. Garlic is a bulb. It makes little baby bulbettes that can break off to the side. A corm would not do that. It's usually short, kind of fat, and it's not going to have all of the layers and make little babies the way that a bulb would. All right, that's where we're going to stop for today. Let me know if you have any questions.